Alrighty. Thanks everyone for coming. It's good to see you all. I'm here again in the Sydney Nerve Center for AIMOS 2020. We call it the Triskelion based on the location of SHIELD in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Matt Makel, who lots of you probably already know. He's an education researcher. I came across his work originally when he published a study estimating the very low rate of replication research in psychology, but he's since done similar studies in other fields, including criminology, which is also a field I'm interested in. And he'll be talking about, I think, his research measuring questionable and open research practices in education research. And I'll just say that really a paradigm of an open meta researcher, because when I asked him for his materials and some advice about how to conduct a similar study in criminology, he was just extremely quick to reply and forthcoming. And it's really a pleasure to try to replicate the work of other like meta researchers, because they're so familiar with the difficulties that usually occur with that. So we're very lucky to have Matt, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Oh yeah, thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for having me and joining me on Zoom tonight, or this morning. Maybe, I don't know if this is why Australians say good day, is just to avoid all the time zone nonsense. But as Jason said, my name is Matt Makel, and I'm an educational psychologist based here in the United States, and I'm currently on the job market. Today, I will be talking about questionable and open research practices, primarily from an education and psychology perspective, but I think many of these issues generalize to other fields as well. To start, I'd like to acknowledge some of my colleagues on this paper that I'll be discussing, but I also will spend a good portion of the talk today talking about some larger issues. So that means if I say anything that's particularly outrageous, that's because I didn't run it by any of them. As a brief overview, I'm going to start with a story and then answer some broad questions of why, what, how much, who, where, what's next, and whataboutism. So, but to start, I want to tell a story, actually a story that of mine, and as well as somebody that I've never met. This is a tweet by Ben Jones where he got a decision letter saying that a journal would not be publishing his work because the data did not support their predictions, and they wanted to know if he could rewrite the front end so that all of a sudden his predictions would have been predicted. This is from late last year. I don't know him, but I know the feeling. Early in my career, I once submitted a manuscript that had 2 studies in it. The first had a relatively clear finding, and the second attempted to build on that, but the results weren't quite as clean. And at the first round of reviews, the editor suggested that we drop the second study because it didn't tell a clear story. Now, these are only 2 anecdotes, but anecdotes are pretty powerful, and some data even suggest that stories are more powerful at persuasion than data. And growing up, my dad would tell stories all the time, but as I got older, I started to notice that the stories would evolve over time. And when I asked him about it, he would always say, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Now, I love my dad, and he's a wonderful storyteller, but he's not a scientist. And as scientists, I think we absolutely must let the facts get in the way of a good story. When we start letting things like clarity and cohesiveness of story drive what we're doing, I think we stop being scientists and we become storytellers. Storytellers is fine, but as scientists, we need to be very clear about when we're telling fiction versus non-fiction stories. So why should we care about all of this stuff? If it's not clear, I'm going to start by asking 2 questions of everybody. And so the first question is, do you believe that the existing academic publications process is 100% error-free? If you think the answer to this question is yes, I'm going to ask you to stay after class to talk to me. Another question is, do you think it's easy for consumers of research to identify when there are errors and problems in research? And again, if you think this answer is yes, then again, stay after class and let's talk, or try to find the recording of Professor Burns' keynote from last night, where she talked about how it is not easy to do this at all. For everyone else who didn't answer yes to either of these questions, great. I'm just hoping that's the most of you. We recognize errors exist and it's not always easy to find them. And that's a problem, and who doesn't love fixing problems? And that brings us to the term that I use in the title of my talk, questionable research practices. Now, I think it's important to spend a little bit of time talking about what that term even means, because I think for some people, the term questionable research practice they associate with bad, and it is never acceptable. But I think if that was actually the definition, then that would be a terrible label for it, because questionable literally means able to be questioned. And so I think so maybe the label may get in the way a little bit, but the earliest definition or frame that I could find is from only 20 years ago. I'm sure others will find something from 400 years ago. But in this paper, it talks about how there's this gray zone between what's considered obvious misconduct and normal scientific practice. Now, I actually think for my purposes, the word normal is not particularly good or ideal here. I think it might be better to call questionable research practices the gray zone between consensus misconduct and consensus acceptable behavior, because what is considered normal or not, you'll find out in a little bit when I show you some data, may not necessarily align with what is considered consensus acceptable. So what are these behaviors that are in this gray zone between clearly permissible and clearly impermissible? So a couple examples might be selectively reporting what results you got, like I was asked to do by the editor by removing study 2 because the story wasn't as clear, or reporting some unexpected results as though you had predicted them, like Ben Jones was asked to do in the tweet that he shared. These are just 2 examples. The bulk of the questionable research practice research focuses on about 10 different behaviors that I'll list and talk about a little bit more in a moment. But we learned last night from Dr. Burns' keynote that problematic behaviors exist and that we don't always have sufficient tools to detect where they are in the published literature. And so what we did to help uncover the prevalence rates of some of these questionable research practices, we did not build a fancy tool that I have no idea how to build in the first place. What we did was we asked people, have you ever done these behaviors or not? And similar to Jason, I was happy to pay it forward and share some of my products and materials with him, because my paper that we had done was itself a replicating a paper that AIMOS president Hannah Fraser, Fiona Fiddler, and a bunch of other AIMOS scholars had done. So we were building on theirs, and they were very generous in sharing some of their materials. And so what we did was ask published education researchers 3 questions about questionable research practices. We asked them to estimate how often they thought these behaviors occurred. We asked them, have you ever done this behavior? And we asked them to say, what's your opinion of this behavior? Is it appropriate or is it not appropriate? We asked a 4th open-ended optional question of what do you think, why, yes or no, but I'm not going to get into those open-ended questions tonight. And so we asked these 3 questions about the 10 questionable research practices, but in a new twist, we also asked the same questions about some open science research practices. And those practices included, have you ever pre-registered your hypotheses or analysis plans? Have you ever shared your data or shared your materials? Have you ever attempted to replicate the work of somebody else? And finally, have you ever posted a copy of your work so that it's open access and not behind a paywall? So I'm going to show you some results in figures that were not probably well designed to be shared on Zoom as I rush through them. If you want to spend more time looking at them, I encourage you to go read our preprint. The link is on here, and I'll show you again the link later. So first we asked folks, to estimate the percentage of researchers in education who had ever engaged in this research practice. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you see the list of questionable research practices, and on the right-hand side, you see the open practices. I'm just going to give you broad stroke pictures of what the results are, because you can see there's quite a bit of variability here. So all the way on the left, you see that our participants estimated that 23% of education researchers had filled in missing data. And that's not an imputation where you report, oh, this was missing at random, missing not at random. This question was specifically about, have you ever filled in missing data and then didn't share that you were filling in this missing data? The estimate was that 23% of education researchers had done this. And this goes all the way up to omitting analyses. Again, like I was asked to do, the estimate was that 61% of education researchers had omitted some analysis that they had conducted. Switching to open research practices, the prevalence estimate was that about 25% of education researchers had shared data at some point, going all the way up to the estimate of 50% of education researchers had published something open access or posted it so that it wasn't behind a paywall. Again, so this is just researchers' estimates for how often they think it happens in the field. We also asked them about their own behavior. Have you ever done this particular behavior? So on here, the black portion of the bars represents participants saying they had never done this behavior. And any shade of gray is they had done it once or they'd done it occasionally versus frequently or almost always. And so here you see all the way on the left, omitting analyses, 67% of our participants admitted saying, yes, I've done this before, at least one time. And then going into the, again, filling in missing data without sharing that you're filling it in, 10% of our participants had said, yes, I've done this. And overall, you see there's variability across the different questionable research practices, but half of the behaviors that we'd asked, at least 40% of our participants had said that they had done it at least one time. Moving over to the open research practices, you see that 78% of our participants said that yes, they had posted at least one manuscript so that it's not behind a paywall, and going all the way up to 43% of our participants said that yes, they had tried to replicate someone else's research, with the other behaviors falling somewhere in between. So there's a lot of variability across which of these behaviors we're looking at, but any of these behaviors, whether questionable or open, were not particularly rare. So this is how often they'd done the behaviors. And then we asked them, what's your opinion? Is this an appropriate behavior or not? So in this version of the figure, the black bars represent our participants saying, you should never do these behaviors, going all the way up to you could do it occasionally, or maybe you should do it almost always or often. So if we start on open science practices here, you see there's almost no black bars anywhere, which means that almost none of our participants were saying that you should never do these behaviors. And in fact, the vast majority of our participants said that you should either do open science practices almost always or often. But then when you shift to the questionable research practices, you see a ton of variability in that, with the majority of our participants saying that it's okay to do these behaviors in some cases for about half of the different questionable research practices. And for me, the big takeaway here is that, at least among education researchers, there does not appear to be a general consensus on whether or not these behaviors should fall under this consensus misconduct or consensus acceptable behavior. There's quite a bit of disagreement about these behaviors amongst education researchers. Now, this is just all our descriptive findings. We also asked who is doing these practices within the community, and we sliced it in 3 different ways. We wanted to know, did it vary based on, did prevalence of doing these behaviors vary based on career stage for early, mid, or late career? We also sliced it across geographic location. Now, relative to Sandy's keynote last night on doing research in the global south, we were looking at a very, up from outer space view. Then, and a finer analysis is definitely required for more granular, because by lumping in all non-US researchers or non-US based researchers, that's a lot of different geographic and cultural variability there that I'm sure we're missing. But for this initial analysis, we just wanted to look at US versus non-US based behaviors because some previous research had looked at that there were some cultural differences in the US versus not in the US. And our third slice was looking at self-reported quantitative researchers versus qualitative researchers. Now, all this matters, we think, because from a prescriptive perspective, we care about who's doing these behaviors, because if we want to devote any resources toward changing behaviors, we want to be able to focus those resources on where the actual behaviors are happening. And so really what we found was that career stage, it didn't really appear to matter too much. There were not any self-reported differences there. For geographic location, it was that US researchers were less likely to report having done many of the questionable research practices and were more likely to report having pre-registered some of their work than non-US based researchers. For the quantitative versus qualitative orientation, there were some statistical significant differences, but none of those differences met our pre-registered meaningful threshold, which was 5%. We said if the two groups were within 5% of each other, that probably wasn't a meaningful difference between them. And now we are not the only group, as Jason had mentioned before, we're not the only group who's asked these questions before. There's actually been quite a few publications here. And here's a quick broad overview of some papers that have been published. Ours was in education. There's been 3 different papers in psychology, and I highlighted some of these findings in yellow because in psychology, some of the wording of the items differed. So for example, on the bottom, we used the phrasing of filling in missing data, whereas in the psychology papers, they actually used the term falsifying data. And so does using these 2 different terms influence how participants respond of whether or not they've done the behavior? That could be driving some of the differences across psychology versus not psychology. But I think at a quick glance, if you look at these behaviors, you see some of the similarities across the fields, that omitting analyses was high in education and it was generally high in the other fields too, whereas the filling in missing data or the falsifying data was the lowest across all the fields. One thing where I see, we didn't run these analyses formally, but if you look at data peaking, which is you collect some data, you look at the results and then say, should I collect more data or not, based on what your results say when you look at them, you see some of the psychology papers are quite a bit higher. They're over half of them. But I wonder if this is a field-specific issue. Like in psychology, if you're collecting data from undergraduate research participants, it might be easier to collect some data, run some analyses, look, and then say, oh, let's collect some more data. Whereas in education, that's not always that easy because you'd have to go find more schools and get them on board and start them up and running. That's just much more difficult. Not to say that education researchers are doing better research, it might just be harder to do some of these questionable research practices. Now, again, as I said, we also did open research practices, and as far as I know, our paper and a recently posted new preprint on communication research also looked at open practices. And when I look at this, these numbers, I feel like, wow, there's actually a lot of open science practices that are happening. But again, this is all self-report, and we've gotten some expressions of concern from some reviewers about, are there biases in responses? So is who's responding coloring our results a little bit? And so it could be that folks who are practicing open sciences, that they're more likely to respond to these types of surveys, meaning that our results are inflated because they want to show off and say, oh, look how special I am. Not every journal will give me a badge for doing this open practice, so I want to show off to the world that I'm doing it. So maybe our results are inflated. But that similar bias concern could also hold for questionable research practices. Now, it could be that questionable research perpetrators feel this need to cleanse their conscience through some anonymous confession, meaning that our results are again higher than they actually should be. Or it could be that folks who are questionable research perpetrators are less likely to respond because they don't want to share about it, even if it is anonymously, meaning that our results could be actually more conservative than what's actually happening in the field. In short, we have no idea which is the case. It could be neither. It could be right. We have no idea, which does bring us to the, so what's next? Well, maybe we should try to find out some other ways to collect data, similar to what Dr. Byrne had expressed in her keynote last night, to find out how often these behaviors are actually occurring in ways other than just asking our participants. But again, based on the variability that we saw in our findings, I think it's important for fields to determine what is acceptable when and for whom is a research behavior. And so the question is like, how do we develop this type of consensus? Well, Brian Nozick, the executive director for the Center for Open Science, has his pyramid and his method for talking about changing the research culture. And I promised that I had this slide in my talk before Paul used a version of it in his talk last night. I find this very appealing, but all due respect to Brian, I think this pyramid is actually incomplete. I think at the base of this pyramid, there has to be an awareness issue that comes first before you can make it possible for it to be relevant. Now, our data suggests that for many researchers, they already are familiar with open research practices, that they're already doing them. And so maybe we do need to work on making it easier, normative, or rewarding. But for questionable research practices, if there isn't a consensus of whether or not it's misconduct or accessible, we might need to almost work on an inverted pyramid for this to make more researchers aware that maybe these practices are not acceptable and shouldn't be done. And so if we make them aware, then we can make it harder for them to use it and make it less normative to use, or make it unrewarding to use them. But that's a long road ahead of us. And it also determines if we're going to do all of those steps, it's going to imply that we actually believe that they're not questionable, that they are misconduct. And I don't think we have that level of consensus yet. There's also whataboutism. I often get some questions about, well, yeah, but what about the theory problems or measurement problems or statistical problems? These crises I'm borrowing from Daniel Hawkins and talks that he likes to give. And whataboutism is, rather than refuting arguments, it's bringing up other issues to discredit the argument. Like all of these problems, I believe, are real in education and in many other fields, but the existence of these problems doesn't mean that questionable research practices aren't also a problem. And if I saw correctly on Twitter today, there's a new paper with a wonderful title of Measurement Schmeasurement that's out by Jessica Flake and Iko Fried, talking about not just questionable research practices, but questionable measurement practices being problematic as well. So what do we do about all of this? Julia Rohr, who is a lecturer at the University of Leipzig in Germany, says, maybe we just need to acknowledge that many things are awful and let's fix as many as we can. And early career scholars like Julia, I think, are one example of, I think, that gives me great optimism about the future of research, of yes, this is exactly what we should do. But fixing problems in questionable research practices is not making our messy stories unrealistically clear by removing all of our problematic results that aren't good stories. That's actually making the problem worse. And I think questionable research practices have the potential to distort our research results to the point where they're just unrecognizable, making them unrealistically attractive, which can lead to massive misinvestment with resources and entire careers. So what can we do, I think, to follow Julia's advice? I think the answer is using more open science research practices. And it doesn't have to be an all or none phenomenon. You can do what you can, when you can, to self-correct your behaviors and help others do so before the problems actually enter into the published research literature in the first place, so that the errors aren't there. And on one final note of encouragement to illustrate the potential benefits of open practices, I really encourage you to post a preprint of your work, because you never know, it could get you invited to give a mini keynote at a really cool international conference that you've never attended before, as happened with me for this particular talk.
Thanks, Matt. Incredible stuff. I think we knew about your stuff before the preprint, but noted. I want to jump into the questions. There's a few. I don't think we'll have time for all of them. So I don't know if you can read them as well, but Matthew Ling wrote, I should read it for all the public. There's a wide variability in the prevalence estimates. Do you have any idea why some people might believe 90% of their peers engage in those behaviors? Was there any association in their estimates?
Well, I guess my training in psychology is not in the clinical or counseling sense, so I try to avoid kind of reading into people's intentions there. So I don't want to delve too much into what they're thinking without just reporting their behavior. And so, I mean, some people say, oh, well, is it because guilt by association? So they think, well, I do it, so everyone else must do it too. I don't know why there's such variability. I mean, it could be some who's an optimist, who's a cynic. I don't know, and I think it's a great follow-up question to find out if there is any association between admission of having done the behavior yourself, and then do you think everyone else has done it too? Because if you think it's a normative behavior for the field, that might give you a little more comfort saying, well, everyone else is doing it, so I should be able to do it too. But we did not look into that at all, and we are trying, because we didn't pre-register those analyses, we tried to avoid doing some of those comparisons. But I think it's a great question.
So very, very hard to say. Fiona Fiddler had a question that I had as well. That I guess as you mentioned, all of the open practice seemed high, but especially replication, which I think your own research would say it should be lower. So do you think it's a definitional issue, or what do you think happened there?
Well, in some of my previous research where we're estimating the prevalence of published replications, whereas in the question here, it's have you ever tried to replicate someone? And this could be a file drawer issue. That where they are trying to replicate somebody else's work, but then they maybe assume no one will publish this because it's already been published, and so they don't try. Or they could have tried to publish it and then been told by reviewers or editors, we don't publish replications. I've been told that by reviewers and editors, and so they may have just given up and saying it's not worth the effort. There could be, why is a conducted replication not published? There could be any number of barriers that stopped it from being published.
Yeah, fair enough. I won't follow up because we have questions. This might have to be the last one. It's from Jenny Byrne, who you mentioned. Apologies to Hannah Fraser. Maybe you two can talk afterwards. And I haven't read this ahead of time, so I'll be reading it. Great, thank you. Agree that field-specific differences in behaviors are important. For example, the equivalent of data peaking can happen in clinical trials to determine that the test intervention isn't causing harm to subjects and to permit early stopping. There's maybe more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
I read it.
But I think the one difference with data peaking, one difference between data peaking there is, again, it's being transparent about saying what you're doing and when. And a great point with clinical trials is you pre-register, here's what we're doing and here's the analysis we're going to do. And if you say, after we collected 10,000 data points, or after 9 months into the clinical trial, we wanted to see where the results were. And I think with a clinical trial on aspirin and heart attacks, they stopped the clinical trial early because they felt the results were so strong that it was unethical to keep giving the placebo to the control group because that was potentially doing them harm, but they were transparent about it. And again, that's with a lot of these behaviors of questionable research practices. I think it's not necessarily doing the behavior, it's not telling people that's what you're doing. That's my personal opinion, but again, there's not a consensus on that.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, in our replication of yours in criminology, I got lots of emails from people saying, I wanted to provide more explanation about why I did that thing in this study, but you didn't give me a chance to do that. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of context there. But I think that the broad line numbers are, as you mentioned, kind of disturbing. Anyway, thanks again, Matt. Really wonderful stuff. Thank you for your time. I have to end it now, unfortunately. There's, just for the audience, there's 3 parallel sessions starting now. You can find them on the schedule. They all seem awesome. And thank you again, Matt, and thank you everyone for coming.